So I'm here as a somewhat unlikely spokesperson for women's rights. I'm unlikely in this field, in this category, for a couple of reasons, probably more than two reasons, but I'll just mention two. Firstly, I did take history at the University of Toronto. I never took a women's studies course. I'm not an expert on feminist academic discourse. Of course, the second reason why I'm a more unlikely spokeswoman for women's rights is that I am against abortion, and I don't believe that it serves women well. And what I do in my work is try and make this a more tenable message, help women find their voice, so to speak, as Debbie Zenny spoke about it, help young women to understand informed consent and maximize freedom of information. And working in the somewhat political zone of Ottawa is oftentimes difficult on this, but it certainly is something where I think there's a lot of gains being made and there's a lot of traction. There's little gifts that the other, I suppose, in this debate, the public debate around abortion and women's rights, which is where I live. There's little gifts that come your way. A most recent one was Bill 34 in Quebec. And I'm not sure if you track with these, the more political side of things, but I certainly do. And this was an attempt on the part of Quebec to legislate the same standards for all outpatient medical clinics. Fairly anodyne little a law coming down, had nothing to do with abortion whatsoever. And lo and behold, women's rights advocates jumped up. They were absolutely incensed, and they said abortion clinics absolutely have to be exempt. It is rare that women's rights advocates make a public stink over demanding lower standards for women, which is basically what they were in asking for abortion clinics to be exempt, is basically what they were advocating for. It certainly wasn't seen that way by the Quebec government, which capitulated to their demands. But that is definitely the way that I saw it, and I believe correctly so. That was the most recent piece that Rebecca Wahlberg and I published in the National Post. So it's just things like this come up from time to time, and you have to grab hold of them. In so doing, in grabbing hold of them, I aim to present the position that abortion, being against abortion, is a decidedly pro-woman stand, that it is the true feminist position, that it enhances and strengthens a woman's position in her work, in her world, with her family, with her husband, with her boyfriend, everywhere. And so this is the case that I'll be making today, that abortion constitutes a significant injustice for women. And I'm not just making the case that it constitutes an injustice for the women who choose it. I make the case that it constitutes the presence of abortion, or I'll try to make the case that the presence of abortion constitutes a significant injustice for all of us. I don't tend to see this struggle as being an epic clash between good and evil, a la Lord of the Rings. All my friends are pro-choice, if you want to use that term. It's not a particularly, hot topic of discussion, but if you ask them, that's what they would say. I see it as a massive, a clash of competing worldviews and a clash of assumptions more than anything else, so I approach it from that standpoint. A little bit more about me and my background. My parents are European and not necessarily given to loud displays of activism. My dad is a real intellect, and I grew up being quizzed at the dinner table on really important questions to him, obscure to everybody else. So I'll give you an example. The questions were pretty tough. You had to be on your toes. So come out, what happened in 1772? This sort of thing. What happened in 1772? Okay, pull yourselves together. It's the first partition of Poland. And then he would follow up with something like, what are they teaching you at that school of yours anyway? Which brings me neatly to my next point. The school of mine was a private all-girls school here in Toronto, one renowned for giving a good education, one that my parents sacrificed greatly in order that I might attend, and one that didn't necessarily teach their values. So I did indeed have a good experience at that school, but the classes they came with a certain ideology, and part and parcel of this ideology was that in this women, all-girls school environment, part and parcel of this was a view that abortion is empowering. It's a choice to be made by any woman. I went on from high school, I took that on a little bit. I went on from high school to University of Toronto, where I did the Master's in History. I was not interested in any kind of activist struggle. I did not speak out on this issue at all. I found my way into journalism through my parents might argue, too many unpaid internships. 2 in Prague in Czech Republic, 1 at Toronto Life magazine here. And then I moved to Calgary to work for the Western Standard, where I think I was starting to become more keenly interested in being public on issues of importance, and one of those being the issue of abortion for women. At the Western Standard, and I'll touch on this later, I did a big piece of investigative journalism on sex selection abortion in Canada and quantifying the extent to which that occurs in Canada. We all knew that it was happening, but it wasn't, there hadn't been a number attached to it. And so then I moved on to Ottawa, and I founded Pro Woman, Pro Life, and so I stand before you as an advocate for women and against abortion at the very same time. And I believe this is a completely compatible position and a case that's easily made. The case is a little bit tougher to make in universities because I come to the position from a different worldview than many of the universities are teaching today, and students absorb. We all absorb, actually. So while I may not need to get into my worldview groundings with you per se, I think it's important to know you have to introduce students that you're talking to perhaps a different way of thinking. Otherwise, the pro-life as empowering for women won't make intuitive sense to them. So one of the first elements of my worldview is that I believe there are absolutes around us. Our culture and our schools are more steeped in a foundation of relativism, that being the idea that whatever works for you need not work for me. So I would tell students they don't need to absolutely agree with what I find to be absolute. They don't, lots of room for debate. But I do believe we can and do indeed know what the zygote, the embryo, the fetus is. And then I would further explain that absolutes do exist all around us. If we step out of a plane, we'll fall to the ground, that kind of thing. And if I talk about abortion with students and I say, I believe life begins at conception, and they say that's fine as an opinion for you, but not for me, and you shouldn't force your view on others, I might counter that by sort of cheekily saying, do you believe that absolutely? And that student might find themselves in a corner, because if they say, no, I don't believe it absolutely, and actually I could be wrong, then they are conversely telling me that I am right, that I do have a right to push my view on others. And if they say, yes, I'm absolutely right, they are also proving that absolutes do indeed exist. The second worldview issue, and again, perhaps not one that this audience will find particularly groundbreaking, I believe that men and women are different. And we cannot make them the same, and we shouldn't try. And so this is something that actually just, if the ladies go to the washroom, there's a discussion of how men and women are not different on the inside of the door. Some students saying that we should all just be raising people as human beings until they decide what gender they are. That's for your enjoyment, ladies, if you go to the washroom right here at this conference, proving my point that the universities are steeped in a very, very different philosophy. And I'm not talking about silly stereotypical things, all women like to shop, or anything ridiculous. I don't actually really like to shop. Or anything silly like all women have lots of shoes. I would ask somebody to define a lot, absolutely, and then I'll tell you whether I have a lot of shoes or not. So men and women are different. And whether that's a point of debate for you, it should be noticed and noted that it is a hallmark of the feminist movement today to diminish or outright deny the differences between the genders. And that same brand of feminism is stridently pro-choice. Some might even say pro-abortion. Christina Hoff Sommers is an American academic and formerly feminist scholar, and she now challenges the prevailing trend in feminist thought, which she calls gender feminism, and she defines that as being, quote, dogmatically attached to the view that men and women are essentially the same. So I think this remains a consequential difference in worldviews between many who support abortion, many who don't. Of course, there's overlap in the categories, but I do believe those are two important bits of information in talking in particular to students. I think coming from these two worldview positions, that's where my idea comes from, that those of us who are more willing to celebrate the complementary and diverse natures of men and women are less willing to support abortion. So those are sort of worldview factors in the background that you might want to keep in the back of your mind, and certainly students on campus would. There are also very tangible reasons, practical reasons, why I argue that abortion does not and has not contributed to women's rights and freedoms. So there's 5 points I've chosen to discuss today, probably many more. I think Dr. Zenny touched on some of those as well. But my 5 points today are the following. First one, access to abortion does not and has not improved the position of women in society. Point 2, many early feminists were against abortion and furthermore in favor of laws criminalizing it for the protection of women, and that will come as news to many, many students, myself included. It's just not part of our cultural consensus or known. The third point, which I'll just skim over later, is health outcomes, because someone like Dr. Zenny is much better and able to talk about that. Health outcomes after abortion are not a universal women's success story. My fourth point is that access to abortion that does mean globally and in Canada as well, missing women because of sex selection abortion. And then the final point is that when we make abortion available, it harms all women and not just those who choose it. So, starting with point 1, access to abortion does not and has not improved the position of women in society. If we look at the historical trajectory of the position of women, we can all accept that there are certain historical injustices and rights infringements that were directed particularly against women. In 1859, married women earned the right to own property in Upper Canada. In 1918, women earned the right to vote. In 1929, the personhood case in Canada recognized women as legal persons. And then in 1988, January 1988, we have the Morgentaler decision at the Supreme Court of Canada making abortion on demand fully available. And so my point here is that we can and do indeed make substantive achievements and changes in discriminatory laws as women, all without access to abortion. And so if I was going to be really diplomatic, I would just say that abortion is neither here nor there for improving the status of women in Canada. If you've heard me speak before, forgive me for telling this anecdote to highlight my point on the irrelevancy of abortion for justice and equality, but I think it's a compelling story. I spoke once to a woman who works in an abortion clinic for a story I was working on, and she told me the scenario of a drug-addicted mother who didn't notice that she was pregnant until the 18th week of her pregnancy, and then decided that she wanted an abortion. And she was told, fine, that she could, but she would have to be clean, i.e. keep herself off drugs in order for the abortion to occur, and she was not able to do that. So she got to the clinic, and she was high, I suppose, and the clinic, as a result, would not do the abortion. And the baby was born itself addicted to drugs. And the irony, she told me, was that had she managed to stay off drugs, the baby, itself already an addict in the womb, would have died. So I ask you, and I would ask any students as well, what does it mean to offer justice in this scenario? What does it mean to offer equality in this scenario? And that's just a question I would leave with them, and I'll leave with you. I do think that in order to fully address how abortion has not helped women, we must be able to overcome and grapple with the back alley abortion argument. And this comes up very frequently in the public debate in which I'm involved. And the argument is, put simply, that legalized abortion saves women's lives, because without it, we would see women suffering and dying in illegal or so-called back alley abortions. So I do want to address that head on. To start with, I think that factual information is absolutely critical. We're led to believe that thousands of women have died in this way. In one province for which I found data, British Columbia, there were 32 cases of abortion-related maternal deaths between 1955 and 1962, and 16 in 1963 to 1970, and then 1 in 1971 to 1986. So that's not a lot, and certainly not what we are led to believe in the public consensus, and that's from the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Still, even one woman dying would lead us to, force us to grapple with the argument, and because that would be tragedy enough. I still don't think that it justifies making abortion available across the board, and one useful analogy that a pro-life doctor I know in Ottawa has made is to ask what the proper response to female circumcision might be. And should we make those safe and legal in hospitals? Or do we look at the act itself of female circumcision and say that's a destructive, misogynistic act, and we won't have any part of it, and we won't sanction that? I consider abortion to be deeply lacking in compassion in a legal clinic, as I would consider it to be deeply lacking in compassion in a back alley. So it's a public consensus that we've arrived at somehow through, I believe, a lack of freedom of information, that we are able to view abortion as compassionate. Which allows us to provide it in our hospitals and sort of allows us to be, I think, somehow taken in by the back alley abortion argument. I feel similarly about abortion as I might about female circumcision, which is a sense of revulsion and not a desire to make the practice safe. There's a great book out there. It's called Pro-Life Feminism. In the United States, and this is where I read about this particular anecdote, the author, Rachel McNair, makes the case that in the United States it was legalizing abortion that brought back alley abortionists back into business. Rachel McNair recounts this story. She says, when abortionist Richard Musey was convicted of a woman's death by abortion in 1968, his license was revoked. And when Roe v. Wade came down, he used it to go to court and get his license back. And she goes on to use some very strong language. She calls abortion the widespread epidemic battering of women, because surgery done on a healthy body is mutilation, and such surgery done without adequately informed consent is a battery. I really like Rachel McNair, I have to say. She's been arrested 17 times for activism, and not pro-life activism. She's against, I guess, nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And so there's this side note in the book, a biography of her talking about, she has also been arrested for pro-life activism, and she compares and contrasts the different arrests, something every parent can be proud of. But I just think that she's got a lot of conviction. She can't easily be put in a box. So she's a good source on some of these questions. So moving on then, my second point was that many early feminists were against abortion, and furthermore in favor of laws criminalizing it. I'm 33, this came as news to me. This is really something unheard of, I think, that early feminists would have been in favor of criminalizing abortion for the protection of women. Early women's activists and reformers did not universally view abortion as part of a broader package of women's rights at all. Rather, they, quote, refused to accept the patriarchal dictum that their own physiology in and of itself was a barrier to public achievement. They put the blame on a society which refused to accommodate and authentically respect their reproductive potential like all their other capacities. So women like Mary Wollstonecraft, who's author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Isabella Beecher Hooker, Susan B. Anthony, these are some of the names of women who are worth looking up who were against abortion. Another explanation is offered for this position that they held. Theirs was an era when men still argued in all seriousness that women were less than human because of their biological inferiority and their purported lack of souls. Interesting. Not surprisingly then, feminists were strongly inclined to reject the argument that other groups of human beings, fetuses included, were non-persons. Feminists were fully conscious that the rationale for oppressing one group, namely that its members were not full-fledged human beings, could be readily used to oppress another. So I think that reintroducing some of this good logic into our universities today would do a lot of women a lot of good, and the freedom of information isn't there to know this right now. There's another interesting case I read about a female doctor, Dr. Charlotte Lazier, who lived between 1844 and 1870, who was presented in her practice with a man and a woman calling themselves cousins, and they wanted to procure a miscarriage. This was in New York. And instead of offering assistance of that sort, she said she would offer help, accommodation, money, etc., and then said that they had come to the wrong place for any such, quote, shameful, revolting, unnatural, and unlawful purpose. Again, strong language before the turn of the century. And then the man, apparently, in the story became irate that this procurement of miscarriage would be denied, whereupon the doctor caused his arrest under the laws of New York for his inhuman proposition. And the story reads that he was held to bail and $1,000 for appearance in court. So I mean, these sorts of anecdotes are pretty fascinating, I think, and certainly not a large part of women's studies programs today. In Canada, Emily Murphy was the first woman police magistrate in the British Empire. She was also against abortion. This is another quote. Murphy supported sex education and birth control, ridiculing religious arguments that promoted celibacy as a means of birth control on the grounds that the sole object of sex was procreation. However, she opposed abortion, which she viewed as murder in embryo, and would have permitted abortion only for those that were approved by a committee of doctors in cases of serious disease or insanity. So we have this example on the Canadian side of the fence as well of early feminists who were by no means pro-abortion, did not view it as being part and parcel of women's rights. My next point was about the health outcomes, and I don't believe that I will spend that much time on this, given that Dr. Debbie Zenny is in a much better position to discuss these things fully. That there are risks associated with abortion is something that is almost fully unknown to my friends and those in the circles that I travel with. So that's a grave injustice in and of itself. We have medical reporters who discuss studies far and wide. It seems like there's a different study in the press every day. Perhaps it's the environmental causes of cancer or the idea of certain diets combating disease. And we never hear any kind of dispassionate medical analysis of abortion-related studies. So one case, a recent case to prove my point, a recent study confirmed prior studies showing one risk of abortion is the subsequent preterm delivery of your first wanted pregnancy, which of course carries with it various associated risks. I believe that this is almost entirely uncontested. The decidedly pro-choice United Kingdom group, the National Health Service, found the study to be thorough and well conducted. They thought it was a very good review that combined the results from studies looking at abortions over the past 30 years. I didn't see this in the Canadian press at all, and it was a Canadian study done at Mount Sinai Hospital and the University of Toronto right here, and funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, published in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So to not even hear a rumor or a little bit about this study, I think, is a grave injustice for women, and freedom of information is clearly not where it should be. Another small sidebar on statistical reporting. We don't really know the state of abortion in Canada that well. In 2006, the most recent year for abortion-related statistics, 4 clinics did not report at all, and the result is it looks like the abortion rate is diminishing, but we don't really know whether that is true if there are clinics that are not reporting their statistics at all. And we don't further know the gestational age of over half of abortions in Canada for 2006. 80% of clinics didn't report the gestational age, and about 43% of hospitals have an unknown gestational age as well. So quite apart from the health outcomes not being brilliant, as Dr. Zenny talked about, I think that there's a problem for researchers attempting to study the data or look at it or identify any links between abortion and subsequent health risks. It becomes more difficult to do. One area which I have looked at more extensively is mental health after abortion, and I brought some of that literature from the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada and put it outside. I do recall speaking to a pro-choice psychologist, Dr. David Ferguson. He's in New Zealand, for the work I did on mental health after abortion. In New Zealand, the main reason why abortions are granted is on mental health grounds, and Dr. Ferguson told me that after studying the mental health effects of abortion, he told me he was gravely concerned that it might actually be causing poor mental health for women, and we don't hear about these results in the press at all. He's done 2 studies by now. There are other people in America as well, Dr. Coleman, doing good work on this topic. Coleman writes, the strongest effects based on the attributable risks indicated that abortion is responsible for more than 10% of the population incidence of alcohol dependence, alcohol abuse, drug dependence, panic disorder, agoraphobia, and bipolar disorder. As well as the increased risk in depression and anxiety and suicide ideation. So to not know about these negative mental health or physical health outcomes, I think is a grave injustice for women who are supposedly have been freed to make an autonomous choice on this topic. My next point was on the nature of sex selection abortion. Beyond theorizing about women's rights, and I think some of the pro-abortion feminist groups should really be looking more closely at what abortion is doing on the ground, what it's doing to women in various countries. We know about this and we hear about this with some regularity. A recent, actually, Globe and Mail article on sex selection abortion in India. But it has also been identified as a trend across the globe. A demographer by the name of Nicholas Eberstadt has looked at this more extensively, and he's the author of a 2006 testimony at the United Nations called The Global War Against Baby Girls. So when we think of missing women due to sex selection abortion, we shouldn't just be pointing fingers at China or India. We should also be looking at places like Greece or Luxembourg or Macedonia. And as I mentioned, I did quantify this trend happening in British Columbia and Ontario, where there are higher immigrant populations from India and China. So we know that this is happening on Canadian soil as well. But in an abortion-friendly culture, you can do absolutely nothing about it. You can try and ban it, but an ultrasound can always be gotten in one place and abortion in another. You actually have certain advocates for women standing up and saying that's just the way that it should be, because perhaps women need to be able to abort their baby girls if they are going to be enduring distress afterwards for having a girl. So they'll come out and make those arguments as well. And they maintain the status quo as being our women's advocates, which is interesting. My final point was on the nature of the availability of abortion and the fact that I believe that it harms all women and not just those who choose it. I believe that access to abortion has significantly altered the way we view women, women's bodies, and the nature of pregnancy. And I swear I had this idea long before an article came out in a magazine called First Things, but there was a recent article called Her Choice, Her Problem by a professor, I believe a law professor, with a PhD from Yale, which I do not have. So that we agree on this is good, and you can cite him as being an authority on this topic. He made a very strong case in this article, saying that sex no longer causes birth. Given the availability of elective abortion, sexual intercourse can only cause choice, and it is choice that causes birth. And my point is that this holds true for every single woman across the country, irrespective of whether she would make that choice or not. And the result is that we are all subject to the new choice regime. And actually, if you think of Dr. Zenny's anecdote in the elevator of being a colleague finding out that she's pregnant and then being subjected to that kind of harassment, that she should go and have an abortion, I think that's evidence of the choice regime around us, that it would not be something that she'd be supported through, rather that there's a big choice to make, and aren't you going to do the smart thing? You wouldn't be so stupid as to keep this baby. In his article, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. In this article, Richard Stith, the Yale professor, law professor with his PhD from Yale, he outlines the negative repercussions of the abortion availability. He says, male responsibility really does end at conception. Mothers alone determine whether children will exist. And this has changed the very nature of responsibility, and it allows women and men to think that there's a way out should the unlikely happen and pregnancy should occur. He argues that the easy access to abortion has increased the expectation and frequency of sexual intercourse, and certainly increasing the expectation of having sex in a relationship is something every woman would be subjected to, whether or not she agrees with abortion. And he cites a study from the Journal of Legal Studies to bolster that point. If a woman chooses birth and not abortion, the child's father can push her away. So the boyfriend's fear of fatherhood, which would have once been focused on having sex itself, is now turns to the pregnancy, to getting her to choose an abortion. Which is an interesting side note. The idea that women freely choose abortion can also be contested. There are a lot of different scholars in looking at this question estimating that 64% of American women who abort feel pressured to do so. Frederica Matthews Green argues in her book Real Choices that, or she identifies rather, that women always abort to satisfy the desires of people around them, almost always abort to satisfy the desires of people around them, people who do not want to care for their children. Interestingly enough, there's a pro-choice feminist, which is always a good resource on this sort of thing, Carol Gilligan. She found in her book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, that women often made choices to abort against their own maternal desires or moral beliefs in order to satisfy and please other people. So Frederica Matthews Green is identified as a pro-lifer, if you want to call her that, and Carol Gilligan absolutely not, and yet they're agreeing on this pressure and the pressure from other people that makes it something less than a free autonomous choice. Some would counter immediately that a woman is not alone in being influenced in favor of keeping the child, but I, as a pro-lifer, am not the one arguing that abortion is a woman's choice or that it's an autonomous decision. I'm the one saying that women need support and help through unwanted pregnancy. So there's a certain hypocrisy in a movement that declares abortion to be a choice at the sole discretion of the woman, knowing full well that this is often not the case. Wrapping up here, and I hope there's been something to tweak your interest in that idea of advocating against abortion on the idea that it's empowering for women, that abortion actually constitutes a woman's burden or her plight. My support for life stems from a logical and rational position that we can indeed do see what life is, and that we can honor and protect that, not at the expense of the mother, but rather in partnership with her. There's no sacrificial lamb. We don't toss one by the wayside in order to support the other, understanding that an unwanted pregnancy is very difficult. And in our choice regime, we're oftentimes not even given the opportunity to support a woman through an unwanted pregnancy because the abortion choice is made so readily and so easily. So women have and indeed will continue to do much without resorting to abortion, if we can get the word out on the empowering nature of supporting life for women, life as a support for women's rights. I think we'll be doing university campuses in particular a great service, and we'll see great changes. So thank you very much for listening.